So that's our big kind of framework, our big driving force is using culture and using that indigenous language nutrition concept to help to steer developmental trajectory in toddlers in a positive way.
How can we create language promotion interventions that are evidence-based, but at the same time, culturally responsive and attuned to the strengths of the families and communities that will use them? In this video, Joshua Allison-Burbank describes how he and his team have fused these critically important aspects of intervention development. They have adapted Talk With Me Baby, a set of evidence-based language promotion strategies for the Navajo community, and they've created language as medicine. Throughout the video, you'll see how Joshua and his team have applied principles outlined in our Expanding the Frame paper. Their intervention, Language as Medicine, stands out for building interventions on family strengths. Joshua explains how they've leveraged the oral tradition of the Navajo culture and have shown caregivers how they can use storytelling for promoting language within their cultural and home routines. This highlights the power of Principle 2, building on family strengths, and Principle 3, co-creating an intervention with the members of the community. I think you'll see that this results in practices that are more user-friendly and in the long term, more sustainable by the families who can benefit from these practices that are both culturally responsive and evidence-based. I'm so pleased to be able to talk with you, Joshua Allison-Burbank, and you've been doing your work in New Mexico. Can you talk about the context of your work just a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So, Yad A, that means hello in the Navajo language. My name is Joshua Allison-Burbank. I'm an assistant scientist and then within the Johns Hopkins University, based out of Baltimore, Maryland. But I'm very fortunate to be able to work in my home community of New Mexico and surrounding tribal communities within this region at the Center for Indigenous Health Southwest Hub, which is based in Albuquerque, New Mexico on unceded Tewa Pueblo lands.
I'd like maybe to start out by having you just talk a little bit about some of the language intervention work, your language is medicine work, and to talk about that and the unique way in which you're applying some of these principles in your work.
So language is medicine, Sud Azayt builds on this concept of language, the language that we speak, the language that we communicate, the language that we even use in sign language, that is medicine and that is sacred. And those interactions that happen in the house between caregivers and young children when it comes to language is being a sacred routine. And so that's what we embed. And that's really the driving force of the caregiver child behavior change that we want to see, which is increased language nutrition. So building on the strengths of the community of the Navajo Nation and other indigenous communities that have strong oral traditions and saying like, that's powerful, that's important. Here's how you can take this one step further to focus on a specific speech or language or literacy area. And here's how that can benefit your child long term.
I guess one of the things that I'm curious about is when you talk about language as medicine, can you elaborate a little bit more on what that actually looks like when a home visitor visits a family and does language is medicine with a family?
So what this looks like is not the traditional sit in the living room, sit on the carpet and engage in book reading. What this intervention looks like is meeting families where they're at. So if it's at the wood pile when we're collecting wood, or if it's feeding the sheep or hauling water, bringing water indoors, that's really where we're providing that parent coaching, that caregiver coaching. And it's not always parents. Sometimes it's grandparents. Sometimes it's the older sibling. Sometimes it's other extended family members too who play a really important role in a young child's developmental growth. So that's the goal of our work, and what we strive to do is to teach our home visitors and families that we can be fostering language growth wherever we're at. And it doesn't need to be these structured settings that come from that colonial mindset of what we've been told for many generations, that here's what reading looks like, or here's what language learning looks like. But for Native people, it's throughout the day, and it looks very different. And so that's what we aim to do with the languages medicine intervention, is to remind parents that they don't need to buy toys, they don't need to buy a lot of fancy gadgets, they don't need to go to anywhere. It starts in the home, and it starts in these very intimate and sacred routines that are happening in most Navajo households already.
Do you remember a time before this approach? And I wonder if you could draw a contrast in terms of how the families engaged with intervention before languages medicine.
Looking back, I see now how I was really not grasping this concept of culturally responsive service delivery, and I hadn't quite applied what I had learned from my training and tailoring of interventions to be community leveraged. But over time, I figured it out, because I realized that the Native families that I'm working with are going to be more likely to do what I tell them if I'm meeting them where they're at. So rather than telling families and talking to families the way I was trained from this kind of Western perspective, that these nuclear families look this way, these households look this way, or everyone has the opportunity to do this and spend time with their children with this particular routine, when I stepped back and said, here's actually what my community does, and I was able to come home and be reminded of these important routines that have always been significant to Navajo families, I realized I needed to change the way I was coaching families, the way I was talking to children, and also the way I was giving these recommendations. And it didn't change the science, though. It didn't change the evidence. These strategies work. We know that these caregiver-child interactions are so important and so powerful for across the lifespan. But the way they're being presented and the way they're being modeled by the practitioner, by the home visitor, has to align with that community. And so that's really what has made our intervention so different from other efforts, other projects that use the same caregiver-facilitated models, is that we are using cultural and home routines as being that primary context for where we're meeting families and where we're delivering that intervention.